She was just hitchhiking to get back home to see her mother, but unfortunately, she would never make it there alive. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Vickie DeBlieux. Viewer discretion is advised. By the way, just in case you hear a dog panting in the background, that's my dog Casey. He is having some anxiety issues today because here in Arizona, in Phoenix, it is downpouring with thunderstorms and he is not a big fan. I gave him calming chews, but he's still a little nervous. So if you hear it, that's what that is. But Vickie Lynn DeBlieux was born on April 18th, 1956. Vickie was born and raised in Louisiana. By the time this case occurs, Vickie is 37 years old and she is a mother. Her daughter would later describe her as being very fun, she was wild, she was crazy, like in a good way. She was so funny. She could make you laugh just so easily. Vickie did the best she could, for her kids, and she was a great mom. But unfortunately, not one, but 4 men would steal Vickie from her family by viciously taking her life. It was February of 1994. Vickie was near the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, and a friend of hers, who I guess lived in the area, dropped her off in Chattanooga, and Vickie's plan was to hitchhike her way to Louisiana to go back home to see her mom. This is in the early 90s. Hitchhiking had at this point started to become kind of a known danger, but it was still something that was still widely used and done by a lot of people still, despite what we now know as the dangers of hitchhiking. But Vickie did it all the time, and she never had any issues, any problems with it. The night of February 21st, 1994, Vickie's friend dropped her off near the I-59 in Chattanooga. Vickie would encounter 4 young men, teenagers. The 4 young men were Carrie Dale Grayson, Kenneth Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Louis Mangione. At that time, they ranged from 17 to 19 years old. Carrie Dale Grayson being the oldest at 19. The 4 boys would encounter Vickie actually in Alabama. This is specifically near the Trussville exit off the I-59 in Alabama. They ask her, hey, where are you going? She says, I'm going to Louisiana. Do you guys think you could take me? They say, yeah, of course we can. And so Vickie gets into the car. She loads up her luggage, and they drive away, fully expecting Vickie to be headed towards Louisiana. But the 4 teenage boys had a completely different thing in mind. Because instead of driving towards Louisiana, they drove Vickie to a very secluded, wooded location there in Alabama, in the Jefferson County area. The 4 teenage boys and Vickie got out of the car. They all sat down in this wooded area and they began to drink beers. Vickie was like, I'm trying to get to Louisiana, like, what are we doing? How long is this going to take? And then, for no reason, completely unprovoked, the 4 teenagers started to throw their glass beer bottles at Vickie, striking her in the head and in the chest. Vickie suddenly gets up and she starts to run away. The young men decide to chase after her, and they take more of their glass bottles and they chuck it at her. One of them hits Vickie in the back of the head, which causes her to fall to the ground. Once all 4 teenagers surrounded her, they began to kick her profusely, they wouldn't stop. It got to a point where they had kicked her so much that she finally stopped moving, but on closer inspection, they learned that she was actually still breathing. And so what they did was they flipped her over. One of them took their foot with their shoe and they stuck it right on her throat, and they pressed down on her throat, slowly suffocating her. They heard her gurgle blood and saw blood come out of her mouth. And eventually she stopped struggling. She stopped moving. And now Vickie DeBlieux stopped breathing. She was dead. The 4 teenagers then took Vickie's lifeless body, put it into the bed of their truck. They drove her and her luggage, everything she had with her, to the Bald Rock Mountain area, where they then took off all of her clothing, they took her jewelry and stole it, and they played with her dead body for a few minutes before just abandoning her there. They actually rolled her off of a cliff and she fell, many feet below. The four young men realized there was blood all over the back of the truck, so they went to a car wash where they got the blood taken out of the truck. They then would go through all of her luggage to see if there was anything valuable, anything they could take, and they took what they could, and then they just disposed of her luggage in the woods as well. They would then take Louis Mangione back home, and then the remaining three would go back to Vickie's body, where they then began they played with her more, they mutilated her body, they would cut out her eyes, they chopped off her fingers. I mean, they just so savagely, ripped her apart for no reason. And they got done what they needed to get done, I guess, and then they left her again. And then sometime shortly after this, there were a couple of hikers who stumbled across the body of Vickie DeBlieux, and they alerted authorities. The coroner would determine that Vickie, this was a horrible death. Her entire skull, there was basically no bone in her skull that was intact. They had fractured every part of her skull. She had bone fractures elsewhere. She had obviously been asphyxiated. They can tell that she had broken bones in her throat. Her left lung had been removed. They also found 180 separate post-mortem stab wounds. And whoever did this had cut 2 very large slits in her chest to open her up and take organs out. But ultimately, her cause of death was blunt force trauma. That is what ended her life. The morning after the teenagers did this, one of the girlfriends of one of these boys would notice that he came home with blood all over him. He just told her, it's blood from a dog, and she just sort of believed it. But Louis Mangione would be the main reason why the 4 individuals were finally apprehended. And that's because he was given some of the fingers of Vickie and he kept them and was showing them off to people. And then he started basically yapping about what happened. And so police found out about all this because they were turned in, and they arrested all 4 of these teenage boys. 19-year-old Kerry would eventually tell police what happened because he said he wasn't going to be the only one to take the fall for this, just because he was the oldest one. This is what he told police. Kenny, TR, Louis, and myself were all drinking very heavily when TR and Louis suggested that we get into a fight. We left and went riding around and found a hitchhiker at the I-59 exit in Trussville, Alabama. We picked her up and we took her to the Pipeline Medical Center East. We were all talking when she made a remark about killing all of us when I threw a beer bottle at her. Then Kenny hit her with his bottle. Louis hit her with his and TR with his. After that, she began to run when Kenny got her in the back of the head with another bottle, causing her to fall. We all ran over and began to kick her and hit her. When she stopped moving, Kenny saw she was still alive and stood on her throat until she died. Then we took her to Pell City and left the body. We then went to the car wash and washed out the bed of Kenny's truck, and we took Louis home. When we got back to my car, TR and Kenny said we had to show them the way to the body, and I did. When we got there, TR and Kenny began to mutilate her body by cutting off the fingers and cutting open the stomach. TR had found a bottle and shoved it into her vaginal area, and Kenny took out her eyes. After this, we dumped the body and left for TR's house. Kenny and I returned to my car, and we went to Hardee's in Chalkville, and all 3 of us fell asleep in the truck, where Kenny's girlfriend woke us up later that morning. After this, Louis Mangione would also tell police something more concerning. He said that Vickie DeBlieux was sacrificed to the devil so that they could drink her blood. But specifically, he said Dale was the one to say that he needed to sacrifice her to Satan because he needed to drink her blood. He said that Dale said it just had to be a relatively young woman, and it needed to be that woman's blood. This is obviously in the mid-90s where the satanic panic thing was running rampant through the entire country. We've had, people who have been convicted of murders. The West Memphis 3 is one you can really bring up, probably the most well-known one, where people were convicted simply because they were perceived to be Satan worshipers or they were sacrificing people to the devil, that whole thing. And so this was right smack in the middle of it. And people were believing it. People really were like, oh, this sacrifice is all out there happening. And this was nothing different. this fed into it even more. But the truth of the matter is that really wasn't the motive. The motive was just they wanted to kill someone. They didn't like sexually assault her while she was alive. They didn't rape her. They did sexually mutilate her after she was dead by sticking a bottle in her. But these were just 4 teenage boys who later on they would kind of say that, you know, some of these kids grew up in unstable households. One of them for sure had bipolar disorder that really wasn't being treated properly. These were 4 obviously very troubled young men, and none of them seemed to be getting the help at all that they needed. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that, you know, there's an excuse for doing what they did. It's more of just kind of explaining what their mindset was, how they were as people. I know that Carrie, at least him, was deemed legally sane to go to trial. All 4 of them were evaluated by psychologists, and basically what it came down to was that all 4 of them, even if they had some psychological issues like bipolar disorder or whatever kind of else disorder they might have, mental disorder. That just scared the crap out of me, and there was a huge burst of thunder there. Not sure if you heard that. But all 4 of them, while they battled psychological mental health issues, all 4 of them were deemed legally sane to stand trial because all 4 of them knew what they were doing. They knew right versus wrong. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but they chose to do it anyway. They made this decision of sound mind. They decided they were going to take this random woman that just so happened to come across them while she's hitchhiking, and they were going to brutalize her. The 4 teenagers, I believe, were tried individually. And what it would come down to is that all 4 of them were eventually found guilty of their parts in the crime. Trace Duncan was the first one of them to go on trial. He was convicted. And in January of 1996, Trace Duncan was sentenced to death. Luis Mangione was the second to go on trial. He was convicted, but he was only sentenced to life in prison without parole. They did not recommend the death penalty for him. Kenneth Loggins was the third one to go on trial. His trial was postponed at least once. Now, he tried to claim that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, but it did not work. The jury did not buy it, and he was convicted of the homicide, and he too was sentenced to death. Carrie Dale was the last to go on trial. He was the oldest of the 4. And in late February of 1996, he was convicted of all charges, and he too was sentenced to death. By March 8th, 1996, all 4 men had gone to trial. All 4 men had been sentenced, and the judges in these cases agreed with the penalties each of them were given. And so he signed off on the death penalties. All 4 of the men, especially the 3 who were on death row, had tried to appeal their convictions numerous times, but they always failed their appeals. It even got to the Alabama Supreme Court, where they also denied their appeals. But then, the saving grace for a couple of these young men was a United States Supreme Court ruling in 2005 that determined it was now unconstitutional to execute any prisoner if the crime they committed happened while they were under the age of 18, while they were minors. And so Trace Duncan and Kenneth Loggins both would end up having their death penalty sentences overturned, and they were then resentenced to life in prison. And initially, that was going to be without parole. But then another case occurred where they deemed that young people under the age of 18 convicted of a crime, they now have to have some type of parole eligibility. So because 3 of the 4 were under the age of 18, 2 of them sentenced to death, those 2 had it reversed. But now all 3 of these men have the possibility of parole after about 30 to 35 years or so, and they are still in prison. But because Carrie Dale Nelson was 19 at the time of the murder, none of this applied to him. He did try to appeal, but it didn't work, and his death sentence was upheld. He would spend about 28 years on death row. So at this time, they were doing lethal injections, but they had also just recently did their first nitrogen gas execution, and it sounds like Carrie's attorneys were trying to argue that he should get that one as well. Basically petitioned himself in 2018 to have that style of execution instead of lethal injection. There were issues though, however, because this was such a new thing, that there were safety risks with it, that it could be botched, that it could cause some kind of pain for the individuals. But in the end, he won out. Nitrogen gas was going to be his style of execution. It sounds like Vickie's son, by the time, the execution is happening, Vickie's son is obviously, her kids are much older. It sounds like her son was okay with the death penalty for Grayson, but her daughter was actually very much against it. She would say, quote, "Society failed this man as a child, and my family suffered because of it. Murdering inmates under the guise of justice needs to stop. No one should have the right to take a person's possibilities, days, and life." So it sounds like she was possibly more willing for leniency with this man. And obviously you're going to have a lot of conflicting, back and forth with this, because obviously the death penalty is not a subject that most of the country really agrees on. Me personally, I've always been pro death penalty if there is guaranteed, just beyond any reasonable doubt, evidence that this person committed the crime. Hard proof, video proof. We know it was them for sure. Sure, okay. But outside of that, there's so many things wrong with the justice system. We get this stuff wrong all the time. Juries get it wrong. Detectives get it wrong. Prosecutors get it wrong. Defense attorneys get it wrong. There's so much room for error. There's a lot of error. We have executed innocent people before. We have had innocent people on death row who have had their convictions overturned completely, and they were released because DNA evidence, for example, cleared them. So it is not worth executing one innocent person in order to execute the rest. And that's kind of where my stance is if you're truly guilty, we know it, sure, go for it. But other than that, it's such a risk. Carrie Dale would have a final meal of soft tacos, beef burritos, a tostada, chips, and guacamole, and a Mountain Dew Baja Blast. Prior to his execution, Grayson used his final words to spew expletives at the prison officers before his execution, and he also raised both middle fingers while strapped to the gurney. What a guy. Carrie was executed by nitrogen hypoxia, and he was pronounced deceased at 6:27 p.m. on November 21st, 2024. That was actually just a few months ago, really, or almost a year ago. 3 men still rot in a prison cell for what they did to this innocent mother. 1 man has been executed. There is hope that these other 3 men never get released, but it is still a possibility. The horrifics of this case and everything they not only did to her while she was alive, the things they did to her when she was dead was just so cruel. It was so disgusting. It was deplorable. It was evil. This was a full-grown human being who had children, who was a loving, caring mother. She had a mother. She was going to go visit her mom. She was, a family member to many, a friend to many. This was a person. And these 4 young kids treated her like she was nothing more than trash. She did nothing wrong to them. The only thing she's guilty of is she wanted to go visit her mom. That's it. No one deserves what happened to Vickie. But in the end, thankfully, the 4 individuals were caught fairly quickly, and all 4 of them were convicted of their crimes. And Vickie DeBlieux got the justice she rightfully deserved. But that is it for this case. True crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you are new here, hello, my name is Mike. I tell true crime stories here on YouTube, obviously. So please subscribe if you're into that kind of thing. Leave a comment below, drop a like so that way more people can see the video. Make sure you hit the bell so you're notified of when I post new videos. I also tell short form true crime stories over on TikTok. The link to my TikTok is in the description of this video below in the link tree. So feel free to follow that if you like to. I also post compilation videos of all of my TikToks of the previous month at the beginning of the following month here on YouTube. So you can always wait for those as well. Also in that link tree below, you'll find my case list. The list is over 7,300 names long. I do choose my cases typically I cover at random, but if there's a case you want me to cover, send me a quick email. My email is also listed below. Just the name of the case, where it happened, and when it happened. I'll add that name to my list. I can't promise you when I'll cover that case, but I will get to it eventually. However, if you are a loved one to a murdered person who maybe it's a cold case, unsolved case, or it's solved but you still want their story told, they're a missing person, whatever the case may be, let me know in the email that you are a loved one and I can make sure that case gets a top priority. But that is it for this video, True Crimer Rooney. So until the next case, ta-ta for now. Meow. Ugh.